think about living things, what do you think is alive? Everybody knows about plants and animals, but what else? There are lots of different things that are alive. So maybe pause the video and see if you can come up with anything, and then we'll go on. So when we categorize things that are alive, besides plants and animals, algae kind of go in with plants, photosynthesize, and get their energy from the sun. But it turns out that there are some other things that can also do photosynthesis, including some protists and bacteria. Fungi would include things like mushrooms and molds and yeasts. There are protists, which tend to be single-celled organisms, and bacteria and archaea. I'll show you a few pictures of these. So here are a few different animals. We've got mammals like me and my cat. We've got birds, we've got fish, amphibians and reptiles and slugs and insects and all sorts of things. For plants and algae, we've got a bunch of different kinds here to show you. Algae tend to live in water for the most part, and most plants are green, but not all. This one just below the title is actually a saprophytic plant that is a little bit like a parasite and gets nutrients from other organisms that it's nearby, usually trees. Fungi, I mentioned, could include yeasts and molds. Usually if a fungus is single cellular, where each organism is one cell, then we call it a yeast. And if it's multicellular, it's called a mold. Most people, when they think of fungi, they only think of mushrooms, and it turns out that the mushroom is the reproductive structure of a fungus. And so if you see mushrooms, there's actually a whole large network of branching root-like structures underground called the mycelium, which is the main body of the fungus. And the mushroom is only the reproductive part that pops up from the ground every once in a while when the fungus is getting ready to reproduce. Some kinds of fungus can exist as either a yeast or a mold, depending on the temperature. You might notice the microscope photo down here. This is some yeast cells. And a lot of fungi, like if there's a mold, sometimes if it gets warmer, like if you breathe in that mold and get a fungal disease inside of your lungs, then at that warm temperature, it will actually split into single-celled yeasts. Protists is kind of a catch-all category, so anything that isn't a plant or animal or fungus or bacteria or archaea kind of gets lumped in with the protists, and there are a ton of different kinds. I've shown you a few over here. This one that is swimming using these hair-like structures called cilia is a paramecium. A lot of protists that have been well studied tend to live in pond water, but not all of them live in pond water. There are some protists that can cause disease. So over on the right here, these are human blood cells, and you can see that some of those have what looks like a little ring inside the blood cell. That is a plasmodium protist, and that is actually the causative agent of the disease malaria. You might have heard of amoebas, which are a large kind of protist, and there are many different kinds of amoebas. Some of them eat paramecium, and some of them can actually infect humans. A lot of them, the dangerous ones, tend to live in water, especially like in hot spring areas. And if they go up your nose, they can get to your brain, and some of them can even cause death. And there have been a few cases, including at least one in Washington State, where somebody was using a neti pot, which is used to like irrigate your sinuses if you're sick. And they were using tap water that had not been boiled or purified at all, and caught this brain-eating amoeba from it. So be careful about those. Unlike some of those others, protists are pretty much always going to be single-celled, so one organism is one cell. There are two major categories of cells called prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. The eukaryotic cells tend to be a lot larger, so protists are made of eukaryotic cells. Bacteria and archaea, they tend to be made of prokaryotic cells. So the magnification on these microscope photos is very similar to the magnification on these photos. So you can see that these cells are much, much bigger than these cells. So each one of those little tiny dots, some have two dots together, that's two different bacteria on there. So bacteria, usually under a microscope, they're going to look like either little circles or rod shapes. And they'll look really, really tiny. So usually when you're studying bacteria, you can't study them just visually. So they are single-celled. Each bacteria is one cell, and they are made of the smaller types of cells called prokaryotic cells. This pink scum that you might have seen on a shower curtain or in the bath at some point, that is actually caused by a particular bacteria called Serratia marchescens, and that bacteria turns pink when it's grown at room temperature. Archaea tend to be very similar to bacteria in appearance. From a microscope photo, you're not going to be able to tell them apart. Up here we have two different kinds of archaea. They are the things we know the least about, and most kinds of archaea cannot be grown in the lab. Nobody knows how to give them the right conditions yet. Most of the ones that have been studied live in really extreme environments, so things like hot springs and in caves and stuff like that. But like bacteria, they have one cell each, and they're made out of those smaller prokaryotic types of cells. So if you're trying to tell a bacteria and archaea apart, they both have cell walls around the outside of their cell, and that's for protection. So it's kind of this sort of thick layer on the outside of the cell. They're made out of different stuff. And also, all living things have a structure inside their cells called a ribosome, and that's going to build proteins for the cells. And those ribosomes are different between bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. If you look at the part of the DNA that codes for making the ribosomes, there's this particular sequence called the 16S rRNA gene that is usually the gene that people use to distinguish on that level what species is this thing that we're looking at. So sometimes if you're trying to look at what are all the different species of bacteria and archaea that live inside of your digestive tract, you might take a sample from somebody's feces, and then you take those samples and you extract the DNA from everything that's in there and run it through this machine and look at that sequence for the 16S rRNA gene that's related to building the ribosome, and you can tell from the differences in the DNA letters on that sequence what kind of species you're looking at and whether it's a bacteria or archaea or eukaryote and what kind. There are some things that are kind of hard to classify what they are. Some are combinations of multiple types of organisms. So lichen, there's some that look like they're hanging down from trees. They're called old man's beard lichens is actually the common name for them. And they are actually a combination of an algae and a fungus living together in a symbiotic relationship. So the algae does photosynthesis and makes the food, and the fungus has those like network of root-like hyphae structures that can spread out and collect water more easily. Lichens are a combination of things, and for it to reproduce, if the fungus makes a little spore and it goes off, it'll just grow a new fungus unless it meets up with an algae at the same time, and then they'll grow a lichen. Slime molds used to be thought of as protists. So we've got two different kinds of slime molds here that I've taken pictures of on hikes. It turns out they're actually different from fungi. They don't have the same kind of cell wall as fungi do. And so now people have lumped them in with protists. So protist is kind of that catch-all category for things with eukaryotic cells that don't really fit in with anything else. Really weird, pretty cool. There's tons of different kind of slime molds. I actually follow some people's Instagram accounts who take cool pictures of slime molds in Australia and stuff. So if we think about all of these different kinds of living things and we think about, okay, what are the things that they have in common that are characteristics of all living things, whether it's a bacteria, a plant, an animal, a protist, an archaea, any of those. Some of the things they all have in common is they've all got to be able to reproduce. Not every individual reproduces. Obviously, some people don't have kids, but at least some of the individuals are capable of reproducing and continuing the species. Growth and development. So even things like protists and bacteria that are only one cell, that cell is going to grow over time. Responding to the environment. We know that animals move. So if there's something, you can respond to things in your environment by, say, making noise, talking to them, running away from something scary, going towards something that you like. But things that are not animals, think about how do they respond to their environment. So here are some examples. Plants tend to grow towards sunlight and they'll bend in that direction. So that's a way they respond to the environment. A lot of plants, if something bites them or starts to eat them, they'll start producing compounds that make them less tasty or more bitter or less digestible. Here we've got a GIF of some bacteria that are moving. A lot of them have these long swimmer tail looking things called flagella at the end that are too small to see in the microscope photo, but they can go towards things like sugars and away from things like dangerous chemicals or antibiotics that could hurt the bacteria. Down here we've got a Venus flytrap, so some plants are actually capable of movement. Some other characteristics of living things. All living things have to have at least one cell. If you don't have a cell, you're not considered alive. So some things have one cell, unicellular things like bacteria, like archaea, like the protists, like yeasts. Some things are multicellular, like many fungi, like plants, like animals. All living things have to be able to process energy, which is called your metabolism. So you got to be able to get nutrients from somewhere. You got to break down the food molecules into small pieces that are small enough to get into your cells. And then you use them for energy in your cells. And then usually when you use energy, it gives off some heat. So you got to be able to get rid of waste heat from your body, like radiates out into the atmosphere. So if you're an animal, most animals will eat other organisms like dead plants, dead animals to get energy. If you're a plant or some kinds of protists and bacteria, you would get energy from the sun and do photosynthesis. Decomposers, like many fungi, will grow their root-like structures into dead leaf litter, trees, stuff like that, and then they'll release digestive enzymes out of their structures, and it'll digest the stuff around them, and then they'll absorb the broken down nutrients back into their body, which is that root-like mycelium if it's a fungus. Regulating your internal environment, so that's also known as homeostasis. So some examples of that would be like humans regulate our body temperature. Usually your temperature stays right around the same level, which is around 37 degrees Celsius or 98 or so Fahrenheit. And if it gets up too high, that indicates that something is wrong. Besides your temperature, you got to regulate your water balance. You got to keep water from escaping from your body by having some kind of coating like skin or a cell wall. You've got to be able to regulate your pH so that you don't dissolve the molecules that are in your body. So all those would be part of regulating your internal environment, which is homeostasis. Regulate our blood pressure, our oxygen levels, all those things. And then the last one would be evolution. Evolution is related to adapting to your environment and having your population be able to change over the course of time. There are a few ways evolution can happen, but one of the major ones is called natural selection. So in natural selection, organisms that best fit their environment are going to be the ones that get selected to reproduce and pass on their genes to the future generation. So this happens on a population level. So you can't do evolution by yourself over your own lifetime. Like if your hair turns gray as you get old, that wasn't evolution. If it happens during your lifetime, not evolution. It requires multiple generations. So it's a change in your population over time. So I've got an example up here. We've got all these beetles. They live in an area where their environment is like a black color, and the beetles are different colors. So there's some variation between them. And it turns out these beetles get eaten by birds, and birds tend to hunt by sight. They're very visual predators. And so the beetles that blend in and are darker colored are less likely to be eaten by the birds because it's hard for the birds to see them. So the birds are going to pick off the light ones and eat more light ones than dark ones. That means that whichever ones are left, which is mostly going to be the dark ones, are going to be the ones that survive long enough to have kids. And if their color is genetic, then dark beetles are more likely to have baby beetles that are also dark colored. Light beetles are more likely to have babies that are also light colored. And so if the dark ones survive better, then they're going to reproduce, make more dark beetles, and after a few generations, most of the beetles in the population are going to have that dark color. There won't be nearly so many light ones anymore. So that kind of shows us there's sort of three things that you need for natural selection to happen. So one is you got to have variation between individuals. So if all the beetles are the same color, population's not going to evolve. Another is that variation has to be genetic so that you can pass it on to your offspring. So if dark beetles were just as likely to have kids that were light colored as dark colored, then you're not going to have evolution over time of that color. And then the third one is sometimes called differential survival and reproduction, meaning that the variation in color, for this example, has to affect the beetle's ability to pass on their genes, to survive long enough to reproduce. There's this term called evolutionary fitness, where your fitness in evolution is not like being strong and buff and going to the gym all the time. It means that you fit your environment, that you're good at surviving and getting food in that environment to the point where you're able to live long enough to have kids. So anything that causes you to be able to pass on your genes more, have more kids, that would be something that affects your fitness. So in this case, the beetles' color definitely affected their fitness because the ones that blended in better were more likely to survive long enough to have kids. Viruses, turns out, are sort of like living things, but they're not considered alive. When people discovered viruses, there's a lot of debate about whether we should consider them alive or not. But ultimately, they're not considered alive because they don't have any cells and they cannot reproduce or process energy on their own. They have to infect a cell to be able to do that. So a virus is usually just a little ball of protein with some spikes on the edge and like some DNA or RNA in the middle of it. So you probably have seen this photo of coronavirus taken under an electron microscope. But those little spikes on the outside of the virus are going to attach to some kind of receptor on the outside of a cell. And then the virus's DNA or RNA will go into the cell and infect it. And the cell is going to read the instructions off the DNA or RNA, and those instructions basically tell the cell how to make a bunch of new viruses. And then those new viruses will burst out of the cell and go and infect other cells. So on this sort of background picture, all of these little things here are a bunch of viruses. So you can see there's tons of viruses infecting this one big cell here. So the ones that are like this one that's dark inside, it has already injected its DNA or RNA into this cell. Whereas that light stuff in there, that's DNA or RNA that is in the virus that hasn't gone into the cell yet. So the viruses, they're just floating around every which way. They don't even have, they can't process energy to even move on their own. They're just kind of going with the flow. And if they happen to bump into a receptor that's the right shape, then they're going to inject their stuff in the cell and it's going to make a bunch of new viruses. But the cell is using its own energy to be able to make the new viruses. And the cell is basically reading those instructions and putting the new viruses together on its own. The viruses can't do that by themselves, so they're not considered alive. So I was thinking about, okay, how are we going to remember this thing? And one of the things that I like to do when I have a list of things I'm trying to remember is to come up with some kind of mnemonic, something that sounds like the letters in the list to help me remember. So let me show you how I did mine. And what I actually did was I was like, okay, maybe I'll use the first letter in some of these. And I was thinking, okay, there's a whole bunch of R's in here, so I probably don't want to use R for all of those. But G sounds good, so I'll maybe highlight that or make it bold. And then evolution sounded a little bit like the word elves. So I was like, okay, what if we did that and then that? I'm going to put these in a different order and I'm going to say GEV sounds kind of like green elves. So I'm going to start making up some kind of sentence that starts with green elves. And then I saw this other one, made of cells, and I was like, that kind of rhymes. Green elves made of cells. So I was like, put that in that order. And then I'm going to move this one down. So green elves made of cells. And I played around with a bunch of other things before I finally came up with one that worked for me. And then I said, okay, I don't want to have quite so many R's. So what are some things like regulate internal environment? Maybe I'll use home in homeostasis instead to remember that, because home is a nice word. And like processing energy, I already had an E in there, so I decided to use met. So I said green elves made of cells met at home to remember metabolism and homeostasis. So putting those in order. Green elves made of cells met at home. And then I had these other two left, reproduction and responding to the environment. So that's two R's. So I could say for R and R. Because R and R, people call that rest and recreation is what R and R stands for. It's like a slang term. So this helped me to remember it, and then I could say green elves made of cells met at home for R and R. So then if I think of that, I'm like, okay, green stands for growth, elf stands for evolution, made of cells, so all things are made, living things are made of cells. Met, that's they do metabolism. At home, so that's they do homeostasis. For R and R, so the last two R's were reproduction and responding to the environment. So that was my memory tip for remembering the characteristics of life. And then if you're thinking of like what kinds of questions you might see on a future quiz about things like this, you might get some multiple choice things like choose all of these things that are characteristics of all living things, or which of these kinds of organisms is not alive, or things like that. So hopefully this helps a little bit.